Writing Music for Games, Part 1, A Brief History of Games and Music in Games. Many video game aficionados will say that the first video game was a game called Space War, created by Steve "Slug" Russell, Martin "Shag" Gretz, and Wayne Wintonen of the fictitious Higham Institute. The year was 1961, and these fun-loving, nicknaming guys were actually from MIT. It's worth noting that they made a two-player game. It was kind of assumed that a game should be played with friends and family. Personally, I just love that one of the first games was based in science fiction. So while some people will say that Space War was the first video game ever made, there's this other guy named William Higginbotham. Now, that's a serious last name, and this guy was a serious physicist. While working at Brookhaven National Laboratory, he created a fun little tennis game by using an analog computer and an oscilloscope. It was a two-player game, but it came out in 1951. All in all, it took him 2 hours to code it into an analog computer and then about 2 weeks to debug it, and it was a huge hit. Well, huge to the visiting public. It was only shown when he had open houses at the laboratory. But it did help bridge the gap between scientists and the public. One thing that was missing from these early games was sound. Sound was first introduced in video games in the 70s, when video games really started to take off and companies like Atari got their start. Nolan Bushnell, the founder of Atari, wanted to bring the game Space War to the public by putting the computer and television monitor in a cabinet and adding control buttons. There was no soundtrack to the game, and there were very rudimentary sound effects, basically just a simple explosion sound when you died. Unfortunately, the first game didn't do that well because they were putting it in bars, and the general public didn't know how to operate 4 control buttons to make the spaceships fly around. Nolan came out with a better idea a little bit later that was actually sort of a derivative of William Higginbotham's tennis game that he created on that old analog computer, and that became a really, really big hit. Now, it still just had simple sounds, but it was way easier to control, and people could play it with friends. Pong made games popular, and the golden age of arcade gaming began. The first video game with a continuous musical score was Space Invaders by Taito. It was 1978, and Space Invaders not only had music playing while you blasted aliens, it also had the music increase in tempo as the game got more stressful. This added a lot of excitement to gaming, and it was the first example of a musical score that was directly related to the gameplay mechanics. Granted, it was simple. It was just a 4-note chromatic scale, but it was groundbreaking and effective. In just 2 years' time, the 80s hit, and gaming became more popular than ever. Arcades began popping up in pizza parlors across America and the world. 1980 saw the release of Namco's Pac-Man, the undisputed king of all video games of 1980. Music was only used at the beginning and the end of the levels and cutscenes, but that music became etched in the collective consciousness of gamers everywhere. Rally X was another game by Namco. The interesting thing about Rally X was that it had an audio channel for the music score, and then it also had another audio channel for the sound effects. The music audio channel ended up having to create some of the effects as well. The music would actually cut out when the player's car let out a smoke screen, but there was an impression of a continuous score and separate sound effects on discrete channels. It was one of the first games with an actual melodic underscore, not just a, chromatic scale like Space Invaders.